The golden crown lay shattered in the mud of Bosworth Field, its precious stones scattered like fallen stars across the blood-soaked earth. Yet to understand how England's mightiest crown came to rest in a hawthorn bush on that fateful August morning of 1480, one must first journey back through the web of betrayal that brought armies to this desolate moor in Leicestershire. King Richard III had worn that crown for barely 2 years, yet in that time he had become the most hated man in England. The rumors followed him like shadows that he had murdered his own nephews, the young princes Edward and Richard, to secure his throne. Whether true or false, the whispers had taken root in the hearts of nobles and commoners alike, poisoning the very air of his court. Richard's pale eyes, cold as winter frosts, fixed upon the distant banners of the Stanley forces. He had been a fool to trust them, but what choice did he have? The realm was bleeding from decades of civil war, and every great house harbored its own ambitions. The Wars of the Roses had turned brother against brother, father against son, until the very soil of England seemed cursed with fraternal blood. According to contemporary accounts documented by the British Battles Historical Society, Richard had spent the night before the battle in restless agitation, rising before dawn to don his armor in the flickering candlelight of his tent. His dreams had been haunted by visions of the dead, not just the princes whose deaths had stained his reputation, but all the countless souls who had perished in the endless cycle of vengeance that had consumed the realm. The morning mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of the armies arrayed below. Henry Tudor's forces were a motley collection of English exiles, French mercenaries, and Welsh long, united only by their common desire to see Richard fall. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in desperation. These were men who had burned their bridges, who had nowhere to retreat. Victory or death were their only options. Richard turned to his nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who would serve as his second-in-command. "If we win this day, Nef, we shall have peace at last. If we lose—" He did not finish the sentence, but both men understood. There would be no mercy for the defeated, no gentle exile or comfortable captivity. The winner would take all, and the loser would find only the cold embrace of the grave. As the armies prepared for battle, messengers rode frantically between the various commanders, each side trying to secure last-minute alliances or detect signs of treachery. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the earth itself knew that by sunset, the fate of England would be decided forever. The morning of August 22nd, 1485, dawned grey and oppressive over the Leicestershire countryside. A thick mist clung to the marshes of Redamore, muffling the sounds of 15,000 men preparing for battle. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the acrid smell of steel being sharpened on wet. Henry Tudor had spent the night in prayer, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles showed white against his weathered skin. At 28 he was lean and sharp-featured, with the calculating eyes of a man who had survived 14 years of exile by trusting no one completely. His claim to the throne was tenuous. At best he ascended from an illegitimate line through his mother, Margaret Beaufort. Yet he had managed to gather an army of the dispossessed and the desperate. "My lord," whispered Sir John Cheney, towering above the other knights like a giant among children, "the Stanley forces remain Lord Thomas Stanley pleads illness and refuses to join either side until the battle is decided." Henry's jaw tightened. He had gambled everything on the promise of Stanley's support. Yet here on the field of battle, when it mattered most, the Stanleys played their own game. It was a deadly dance of betrayal that had become all too familiar in these blood-soaked years of civil war. The rebel army was arranged in 3 battles, as was the custom. The vanguard, commanded by John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, consisted of French mercenaries and English exiles who had followed Henry across the Channel. These men bore the scars of countless battles, their faces grim with the knowledge that defeat meant certain death. Behind them stood Henry's own battle, composed mainly of Welsh longbowmen and men-at-arms who had rallied to his dragon banner as he marched through Wales. On the opposite hill, King Richard's army presented a far more impressive sight. The royal battle formation glittered with the finest armor money could buy, their surcoats bearing the proud heraldry of England's greatest houses. Yet even among his own men, Richard could sense the uncertainty. Too many had loved his brother Edward IV, too many whispered about the fate of the princes, too many questioned whether God's grace truly rested upon their king. The first movements began shortly after dawn. Oxford's vanguard advanced down the slope, their steel-tipped pikes gleaming in the pale morning light. The French mercenaries moved with professional precision, their ranks dressed as straight as a sword blade. Behind them came the English exiles, hungry for revenge against the king who had driven them from their homeland. Richard's response was swift and decisive. The Earl of Northumberland, commanding the rear guard, was ordered to advance and engage the enemy flanks. John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, led the royal vanguard forward to meet Oxford's charge. The clash, when it came, was like thunder rolling across the countryside. Steel rang against steel as the two forces collided in the marshy ground below Ambion Hill. The French mercenaries, seasoned veterans of continental warfare, held their ground against the fierce charge of Norfolk's men. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air, and the screams of wounded horses mingled with the battle cries of fighting men. But even as the main battle raged, all eyes were on the Stanley forces. Lord Thomas Stanley commanded the larger force to the south, while his brother Sir William Stanley held the northern flank with his own retinue. Both armies knew that whichever side the Stanleys chose to support would likely emerge victorious. The battle swayed back and forth across the muddy field for what seemed like hours. Norfolk's men, despite their superior numbers, found themselves hard-pressed by the disciplined advance of Oxford's troops. The Duke of Norfolk himself fell early in the fighting, struck down by an arrow that found the gap in his visor. His death sent a shiver of uncertainty through the royal ranks. King Richard, watching the battle from his position on Ambion Hill, could see his advantage slipping away. The morning that had begun with such promise now seemed to darken with each passing moment. His own men were brave and well-equipped, but they lacked the desperate hunger of men fighting for their very survival. It was then that Richard made the decision that would define not just the battle, but the very course of English history. Rather than commit his reserves to support Norfolk's faltering advance, he chose to gamble everything on a single, decisive charge. He had spotted Henry Tudor's banner among the rear ranks of the rebel army, and he knew that if he could kill the pretender with his own hands, the rebellion would collapse like a house of cards. The battle had raged for 3 hours when King Richard III made his fateful decision. Standing in his stirrups atop Ambion Hill, the crown of England gleaming upon his helmet, he surveyed the carnage below with cold, calculating eyes. The Duke of Norfolk lay dead among the trampled reeds, his royal standard fallen and bloody. The Earl of Oxford's disciplined advance had broken the back of the royal vanguard, and panic was beginning to spread through the ranks of Richard's army. "My lord," gasped Sir Robert Brackenbury, the king's most trusted lieutenant, blood streaming from a wound on his forehead. "Northumberland's men refuse to advance. They claim the ground is too marshy, but I fear they wait to see which way the wind blows." Richard's pale eyes blazed with fury. Even now, with the fate of England hanging in the balance, his own nobles played their games of self. The Earl of Northumberland, commanding 3,000 men in the rearguard, had held his forces in reserve throughout the morning, claiming the tactical situation was too fluid to commit. But Richard knew better. Like vultures circling carrion, they waited to see which side would prevail before choosing their allegiance. The king's gaze swept across the battlefield, until it fixed upon a cluster of banners in the distance. There, surrounded by a small bodyguard of knights and manatams, flew the Red Dragon of Wolsey, Henry Tudor's personal standard. The pretender had positioned himself well away from the main fighting, as befitted a man who had spent more time in exile than in battle. But he was there, within reach, and Richard knew that a single, decisive stroke could end this rebellion forever. "Saddle my destrier," the king commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Plantagenet kings. "We ride for Tudor." Sir Richard Ratcliffe, the king's childhood friend and most loyal supporter, seized his master's bridle. "Your Grace, it is madness. You are the King of England. You cannot risk yourself in such a venture. Let me lead the charge, or Sir Robert, or any of your knights, but not you." But Richard shook his head. His decision made, "This realm has bled for 30 years because we kings feared to act decisively. I will not be remembered as another Henry VI, driven from my throne by lesser men. If I am to die, let it be as a king should die, with sword in hand and facing my enemies." The king's household knights, perhaps 100 men in all, formed up around their sovereign. These were the cream of English chivalry, men who had served Richard faithfully through his years as Duke of Gloucester and remained loyal even as the kingdom turned against him. Sir William Conyers, Sir James Harrington, Sir Robert Percy, names that would be remembered in ballads and chronicles for generations to come. As they prepared to descend from Ambion Hill, Richard cast one last glance toward the Stanley forces. Both Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother Sir William remained motionless, their banners hanging limp in the still air. The king's jaw tightened. He had offered them honors, lands, and titles, yet they repaid his generosity with calculated neutrality. Very well. If he could not count on their loyalty, he would do without it. The charge began at a walk, then broke into a trot as the knights navigated the steep slope of Ambion Hill. The rebel army, engaged in their struggle with Norfolk's remaining forces, initially failed to notice the approach of the royal household. Henry Tudor's dragon banner flew perhaps half a mile away, across ground that seemed to stretch like an eternity before the charging horsemen. As they reached the level ground, Richard spurred his destrier to a gallop. The thundering of hooves drummed across the battlefield like the beating of a giant's heart. The white boar of York, Richard's personal emblem, streamed from his lance head as he led his men toward their destiny. The first of Tudor's bodyguard to spot the approaching cavalry was Sir John Cheney, the massive knight who served as Henry's standard-bearer. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and broad as an oak tree, Cheney had never been bested in single combat. But as he turned to face the king's charge, Richard's lance took him full in the chest, lifting him from his saddle and hurling him to the ground like a broken doll. The shock of the royal charge scattered Tudor's bodyguard like leaves before a hurricane. Knights who had followed Henry across the Channel from France, men who had survived the intrigues of foreign courts and the dangers of exile, found themselves overwhelmed by the fury of Richard's assault. The king fought like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, each stroke bringing him closer to his goal. Henry Tudor himself, no warrior despite his royal pretensions, found himself face to face with the King of England. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two men stared at each other across the carnage of the battlefield. Richard, his crown askew and his armor dented, raised his sword for the killing blow that would end the rebellion forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The clash of steel rang out across the battlefield as King Richard III raised his sword above Henry Tudor's head. For one crystalline moment, the entire course of English history balanced on the edge of a blade. The crown of England, worn by kings since the days of the Conqueror, seemed ablaze with its own inner fire as Richard prepared to strike down the pretender who dared challenge his divine right to rule. Henry Tudor, unhorsed and sprawling in the mud, raised his own blade in a desperate attempt to ward off the blow. He was no warrior. His years of exile had been spent in the subtle arts of diplomacy and intrigue rather than the brutal craft of warfare. His hand trembled as he stared up at the king, seeing death reflected in those pale, merciless eyes. "So dies the last hope of Lancaster," Richard snarled, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over this small portion of the battlefield. Around them, the scattered bodies of Tudor's bodyguard bore witness to the fury of the royal charge. Sir John Cheney, the giant knight, lay motionless where Richard's lance had felled him. Sir William Brandon, Tudor's standard-bearer, had been cut down trying to protect his master. The Red Dragon of Wales trampled into the blood-soaked earth. But as Richard's sword began its downward arc, a new sound rose above the din of distant battle, the thunder of approaching hooves. Sir William Stanley, who had held his forces in careful neutrality throughout the morning, had finally chosen his side. 3,000 men bearing the Stanley badge swept down from the northern hills like an avalanche of steel and fury. For Henry Tudor, Stanley's voice boomed across the field. For the rightful King of England, the betrayal struck Richard like a physical blow. He had trusted the Stanleys, had believed their promises of loyalty to the crown. Even when Lord Thomas Stanley had pleaded illness and refused to commit his forces, Richard had hoped that family ties would keep them neutral. But now, in the moment of his greatest triumph, they had revealed their true allegiance. Richard's knights, who had followed their king with such courage and determination, found themselves suddenly outnumbered and surrounded. The men who had carved a path through Tudor's bodyguard now faced fresh enemies on all sides. Sir Richard Ratcliffe, the king's oldest friend, fell with a crossbow bolt through his throat. Sir Robert Brackenbury, who had served as constable of the Tower, went down beneath a forest of enemy spears. But Richard fought on, his sword singing its deadly song. As he carved a path through the press of enemies, the crown upon his helmet, that symbol of royal authority that had been worn by kings for 4 centuries, became a target for every rebel blade. Men who had never dared look upon the king's face now pressed forward eagerly, sensing that history was being made before their eyes. Historical accounts preserved by the National Archives document how Richard's final moments were witnessed by men from both armies. Their testimonies later recorded for posterity. The king, they said, fought like a lion at bay, his sword never still, his voice never failing to cry out the battle cry of York. Even his enemies, in later years, would speak with grudging admiration of his courage in those final moments. Henry Tudor, meanwhile, had been helped to his feet by his surviving knights. The pretender's face was pale with shock and fear. He had come within a sword's length of death, and the knowledge of how close he had come to ending his rebellion left him shaken. Yet, as he watched Richard's desperate last stand, he felt something else. A grudging respect for the man who had been his enemy. "He fights like a true king," Henry whispered to John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, who had come to his aid. "Whatever else may be said of Richard of Gloucester, none can question his courage." The circle of enemies pressed closer around the king. A Welsh spearman, emboldened by the sight of the royal crown, thrust his weapon toward Richard's head. The king's sword swept around in a glittering arc, severing the spear shaft and opening the man's throat in a single motion. But there were too many of them, and Richard's strength was beginning to fail. Sir William Stanley himself pressed forward, his sword seeking the gaps in the royal armor. Behind him came a score of his best knights, each eager to claim the honor of killing the king. the white boar of York. Richard's personal emblem was torn from his surcoat and trampled underfoot. The crown, that golden circlet that had graced the heads of English kings since time immemorial, was struck from his helmet and sent spinning into the mud. Richard stumbled, his legs buckling beneath the weight of his armor and the accumulated wounds of battle. Blood ran freely from a gash on his forehead, clouding his vision. His sword arm, which had served him so faithfully through 20 years of warfare, grew heavy and slow, yet still he fought on, driven by a pride that would not bend and a royal dignity that death itself could not diminish. The end came swiftly. A dozen blades found their mark almost simultaneously, and Richard of Gloucester, third of that name, King of England and France, Lord of Ireland, fell face forward into the mud of Bosworth Field. The crown of England rolled away from his lifeless fingers, coming to rest beneath a hawthorn bush, where it would be found by a common soldier and carried to the new king. The battlefield fell silent save for the groans of the wounded and the distant cries of carrion birds already circling overhead. King Richard III lay sprawled in the mud, his royal blood seeping into the earth of Leicestershire, while around him the scattered remnants of his household guard were methodically hunted down by Henry Tudor's victorious forces. Sir William Stanley stood over the fallen king, his sword still dripping with royal blood. The betrayal was complete, but even in victory, Stanley felt the weight of what he had done. Richard had been a usurper, perhaps, but he had also been a king anointed by God, and the act of regicide was not one that sat easily on any Christian conscience. "Where is the crown?" Henry Tudor's voice cut through the morning air as he approached the scene of his rival's death. The pretender had regained his composure, and now surveyed the battlefield with the calculating gaze of a man who had just won the greatest gamble of his life. The royal crown, that golden circlet that had adorned the heads of English kings since the Norman conquest, was nowhere to be seen. In the fury of the final charge and the chaos of Richard's last stand, it had been lost among the trampled grass and mud-churned earth. For a moment, panic flickered across Henry's face. What good was victory if he could not claim the physical symbol of royal authority? "Search everywhere," he commanded his knights. "That crown must be found. Without it, men will say I am no true king, but merely another pretender to the throne." The soldiers spread out across the immediate area, overturning bodies and searching through the debris of battle. It was a Welsh archer, a common soldier whose name would never be recorded in the chronicles, who spotted the glint of gold beneath a hawthorn bush some 50 yards from where Richard had fallen. The crown had rolled there in the confusion, its precious stones catching the pale morning light like trapped stars. The archer's shout brought Henry and his nobles running. There, nestled among the thorns like some fairy tale treasure, lay the crown of England. Henry reached for it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders. The golden circlet was dented and mud-stained, but it was intact, and more importantly, it was his. According to detailed accounts preserved by the Richard III Society, what happened next would become one of the most iconic moments in English history. Lord Thomas Stanley, who had finally committed his forces to Henry's cause in the battle's final moments, took the crown from the hawthorn bush and placed it upon Henry's head. The symbolic act was performed on a small hill overlooking the battlefield, a mound that would forever after be known as Crown Hill. "Long live the king!" Stanley's voice boomed across the field. "Long live King Henry VII!" The cry was taken up by the victorious army, though many of the voices carried more relief than enthusiasm. These men had followed Henry not out of love, but out of hatred for Richard and hope for something better. Whether this Welsh exile would prove a better king than the man he had defeated remained to be seen. As Henry stood crowned upon Crown Hill, the full scope of his victory became clear. The Earl of Northumberland, who had held his forces in reserve throughout the battle, now came forward to offer his submission. The turncoat lord knelt before the new king, his banner lowered in surrender. Behind him came a stream of other nobles, each eager to declare their loyalty to the victor. But not all of Richard's supporters were so quick to abandon their fallen king. The Earl of Lincoln, Richard's nephew and designated heir, had escaped the battlefield with a handful of loyal retainers. He would live to fight another day, carrying the Yorkist cause into exile and preparing for future rebellions. The Wars of the Roses were not yet over, though this day had surely marked the beginning of their end. The treatment of Richard's body became a matter of immediate concern. Some of Henry's advisors counseled that the dead king should be displayed publicly to prove beyond doubt that the usurper was truly dead. Others argued for a more respectful burial, befitting a crowned king of England. Henry himself seemed torn between pragmatism and the demands of royal dignity. In the end, practicality won out. Richard's body was stripped of its armor and slung naked across a pack-horse for the journey to Leicester, the site of the dead king. His body, marked by 11 wounds and caked with mud and blood, was witnessed by hundreds of common folk who lined the roads. It was a deliberate humiliation, designed to demonstrate the completeness of Henry's victory. The Battle of Bosworth Field was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries. The Tudor dynasty, founded on that muddy field in Leicestershire, would rule England for the next 118 years. Henry's descendants would include some of the most famous monarchs in English history, who would break with Rome and establish the Church of England. Mary, who would attempt to restore Catholic faith. and Elizabeth I who would preside over England's golden age. But all of that lay in the future. For now, as the sun reached its zenith over Bosworth Field, there was only the immediate aftermath of victory and defeat, the sorting of the living from the dead, and the first tentative steps toward a new age in English history. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Bosworth Field as Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII by right of conquest, surveyed the aftermath of his victory. The battlefield was strewn with the bodies of the fallen, their armor glinting dully in the fading light. The crimson banner of Lancaster flew once again over English soil, though it would be many years before the realm would know true peace. The new king's first act was to issue a general amnesty to all who had fought for Richard, save for those few who had been most closely associated with the dead monarch's alleged crimes. It was a politic move, designed to heal the wounds of civil war and unite the kingdom under his rule. Yet Henry knew that words alone would not be sufficient to secure his throne. The crown he wore had been won by the sword, and it would need to be defended by the sword. The immediate task was to prevent the escape of Richard's remaining supporters. The Earl of Lincoln, who had commanded the left wing of the Royal Army, had fled the field with a small band of loyal retainers. Francis Lavelle, Richard's closest friend and Lord Chamberlain, had also vanished in the confusion of defeat. These men would not simply accept Henry's victory, and the new king knew that they would seek foreign support for their cause. So William Stanley, the architect of Henry's victory, knelt before his new sovereign to receive his reward. The man who had held the balance of power in his hands throughout the battle was granted the title of Lord Chamberlain, one of the highest offices in the realm. Yet, even as he accepted Stanley's homage, Henry's eyes were calculating. The man who had betrayed one king for advantage might easily betray another. The body of Richard III, meanwhile, had been taken to Leicester for burial. The Greyfriars Monastery agreed to receive the remains of the fallen king, though the ceremony was deliberately modest. No elaborate tomb was constructed, no magnificent effigy commissioned. Richard was laid to rest beneath a simple stone slab, his grave marked only by his name and the date of his death. As documented by contemporary sources referenced in the historic UK archives, Henry's victory at Bosworth was seen by many as divine judgment upon Richard's use. The new king was careful to encourage this interpretation, commissioning chroniclers to portray his triumph as the restoration of rightful rule after years of tyranny. The Battle of Bosworth Field was recast as a moral victory, the triumph of good over evil. Yet Henry knew that legitimacy could not be won through propaganda alone. His claim to the throne was weak, based on descent from an illegitimate line and strengthened only by his marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. The union of Lancaster and York, symbolized by the red and white roses that would become the Tudor emblem, was essential to his dynasty's survival. The wedding took place in January 1486, 5 months after the battle. Elizabeth of York, the daughter of kings, became the bride of the Welsh exile who had seized her father's crown. It was a marriage born of political necessity rather than love, yet it would prove to be the foundation of one of England's most successful dynasties. The immediate aftermath of Bosworth also saw the establishment of the institutions that would characterize Tudor rule. Henry surrounded himself with capable administrators rather than great nobles, preferring men who owed their position to his favor rather than their birth. The age of the overmighty subject was ending, replaced by a new model of royal authority based on centralized administration and professional bureaucracy. The Battle of Bosworth Field had lasted less than a day, yet its consequences would shape England for generations. The death of Richard III marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for 3 centuries. The rise of Henry Tudor began the Tudor Age, an era that would see England's transformation from a war-torn medieval kingdom into a major European power. The battlefield itself was left to return to its natural state, though local tradition would preserve the memory of that August day in Crown Hill, where Henry had been crowned with Richard's circlet, became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the forces that had shaped their nation's destiny. As night fell over Leicestershire, the new king prepared for the journey to London and his coronation. The crown of England, battered and mud-stained from its time among the hawthorn thorns, had been cleaned and polished. It would grace Henry's head at Westminster Abbey, just as it had crowned his predecessors for centuries past. The Battle of Bosworth Field was over, but its legacy would endure. The Tudor rose, combining the red of Lancaster and the white of York, would become one of the most recognizable symbols in English history. The dynasty founded on that muddy field in Leicestershire would produce some of England's most famous monarchs and would preside over the nation's emergence as a world power. Richard III lay in his simple grave, the last king of England to die in battle. His death had ended the medieval age and ushered in the early modern period, though none who witnessed that day could have foreseen the full magnitude of the changes that would follow. The crown had passed from one dynasty to another, but the kingdom it represented would soon be transformed beyond recognition. The ashes of the Golden Crown had been scattered across Bosworth Field, but from those ashes would rise a new England, one that would conquer dissonant shores and write its name across the pages of history in letters of gold.